Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event. We were established back in 1995 to honor the service of Thomas S. Foley, who was a former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and served the people in the 5th Congressional District for nearly 30 years. And our mission here on campus is really threefold. It's to promote research on public policy issues. It is also to engage students in the university community in public service, and we do that primarily through our internships in Washington, D.C., Olympia, and elsewhere. And so if any of you are interested in internships, you should come talk to us. We're on the 4th floor of Johnson Tower. And then finally, one of our key missions is to educate the public about important issues of public policy and public affairs, and we do that by bringing to campus elected officials and public policy experts in various areas. And so it's really a distinct honor and privilege today to have with us one of those experts. Dr. Cristian Orrego is a criminalist supervisor in forensic genetics and the assistant laboratory director at the Bashinski DNA Laboratory of the Department of Justice in Richmond, California. Dr. Orrego is also a founding member of the Alliance of Forensic Scientists for Human Rights and Humanitarian Investigations. From 2006 to 2009, he served as an advisor to the Chilean government on scientific and technical topics related to the identification of missing persons who were victims of the military government in that country. So without any further ado, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Orrego.
Thank you, Professor Clayton. I just realized that the logo of the university says world-class face-to-face, which is much preferable to webinars whenever possible. So wonderful to be here with you. And to be here to discuss, and I'm not going to go beyond 25 minutes, though what I could share with you could take much longer, so as to give you a voice as well within the time that we have allotted. As I believe that there is much that needs to be done from other fields to enhance the interaction of the forensic sciences and human rights. And let me define human rights. Human rights as defined by international covenants such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 3 says very precisely, every person has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Then, more relevant to the discussion today, as I'm going to use more than one personal experience in the field, referring to the rights of identity of children. In 1989, most countries, I understand, the covenant for the rights of children, and interestingly, Articles 8 and 9 came from a human rights organization in Argentina, I'll tell you about it later, states that, and it was signed in 1989, I said that, and ratified by all countries with the exception of 2, I don't know which those 2 are, indicates that children will be soon after birth, no, not soon after, immediately after birth, be registered, and that they have to be given a name, they have to receive a nationality, and will have the right to protect their identity. There are other covenants that refer to identity as well. The Geneva Convention, 1949, states that victims of war and civil conflict should be identified, dead victims, should be identified with a view of producing a report. It has to be documented. And then other rights that have emerged in instruments of humanitarian law more recently is the Convention Against Enforced Disappearance, where under no circumstances a person can be abducted, kidnapped, without soon after due process of law. That's not exactly the language, but that's the spirit. And many countries have not signed that yet, the convention. Well, since it's politics, and it's good that I'm invited to talk about politics with good coffee. Politics was the topic de rigueur, if I might say, during my early years when I grew up. I was born and grew up in Chile. You know, politics was part of the conversation at every night at a dinner table. So, but in science, one tends to leave that aside a lot. And therefore, this is a most welcome occasion for me to expand, however naively. I'm sure that there are political scientists here and international lawyers perhaps, or soon wish to be, that will might take exceptions to my statements, but that's what the dialogue is all about. The one way to talk about science, the applications of forensic science, and I'm talking about forensic genetics, what otherwise you hear now mentioned as genomics, biotechnology, modern forensic genetics, molecular biology, all the omics that now invade modern biology and genetics. It has made an enormous impact in law enforcement, as you well know from law enforcement in this country, where DNA evidence becomes tremendously persuasive evidence to present in court. All of these have, and from early on, in the 1980s, as I'm going to describe to you in a moment, make an impact in human rights investigations. And since I said a moment ago, since politics is such an important variable in human history, let me take you back to the Middle 80s. Because I'm going to start my personal story, if you will, as a witness and participant in some aspects in early 1984. Middle 80s, late 70s, middle 80s, the world still caught into the merciless logic of the Cold War, and especially Latin America and Central America, where by the late 70s, in fact, in Chile it started in 1973, in Argentina 1976, the end of democracy come to these countries with the establishment of military dictatorships, which apply the famous principle of national security, where the enemies are not from abroad anymore, but they are to be found within the population, and therefore enforce disappearance, abduction, disappearance followed by murdered and clandestine burial or of victims becomes one of the favorite tools of state-sponsored repression. State-sponsored repression, which becomes soon after, as you might well know, a method of terror in order to control population that is either against, in any way, against the status or not, but in order to control populations and establish other policies without any civil response. So this is the 1970s with brutal dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and under Pinochet in Chile, he invents this integration of repression with Condor operation, where countries, intelligence services and security services from internal security services from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, all begin to integrate and talk to each other and exchange prisoners. Most of them to disappear later. That history is being documented to this day. go to the National Security Archives in Washington, where the documents that the intelligence agencies here in this country were obtaining from what they were observing or even participating in South America has produced a wealth of material, the documents for the scholarly pursuit, if you will, and it should be scholarly pursuit, certainly, what happened at during those years. Central America, Civil War in El Salvador, 1980 to 1992. Intervention in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government that raises all kinds of red flags during the Reagan years here, intervention in Nicaragua. Costa Rica hanging by its bare teeth to maintain some neutrality in all this, successfully so. Remarkable and interesting example of how a country without an army was able to maintain and not be subverted into the conflict. In all of these situations, Guatemala, a civil war, especially a repression on the native communities of Guatemala, that continues to this day. Colombia, Colombia was able to maintain democratic governments, but with a silenced civil war in which so many have died and disappeared as well to this day. Some of these are not totally resolved issues. So with that backdrop, with that context, let me then tell you about what I saw, which was provided a defining moment in my life, because I was, until 1984, a molecular biologist. I was doing research in microbiology at the National Institutes of Health at the time. And I was a member of a committee on scientific freedom that the American Association for the Advancement of Science, during the Vietnam years, because of demands from the scientific community to look into issues of science and human rights and conflict and war, the Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility of the AAAS looked very, very closely into the repression in Central and South America as it affected the intellectual community, university professors, the physicians, medical public health workers, many of them who were doing some remarkable work in the documentation of torture. And I was a member of that committee. And in early 1984, the committee receives a visit from three ladies from an organization that had formed in 1977 in Argentina, a year after the implantation of the military junta there, called the organization called Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. What emerged, thousands in Argentina have disappeared during those short 8 years, 76 to 83. The military junta in Argentina imploded, sort of self-destructed with the Falkland Wars. Had it not been for it, who knows how many more years of enormous human desolation would have visited Argentina. Well, and there are at least 8,000 very well documented instances of disappearance, many of them persons not yet found in Argentina. But Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo realized that their children, adults, married, were being kidnapped, many a time with their children or with the mother expecting a child, taken into captivity. The couple disappeared, and then they began to realize that the babies born in captivity or released afterwards had they been taken alive with their parents, were alive. and that they were in the hands, many a time, of families of the military. They had been adopted in a clandestine, illegal manner, if you will. So Grandmother's Plaza de Mayo arrives in Washington, D.C. in 1984 to the AAAS to say, would it be possible to use genetics to confirm the identity of a child that we suspect is one of our grandchildren? And that had not occurred to geneticists anywhere that I know of or that we knew of at the time, because we are all familiar with the paternity index. To use genetics to confirm paternity, we're not familiar, or this was the first time we were asked, geneticists were asked, is it possible to extend one generation the power of genetic analysis to make a reliable statement about kinship across one generation? Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo also brought with to the AAAS an invitation from, it was an invitation, it was rather a question. Would the AAAS be capable of putting together a group of experts that would advise the government, the newly elected government of President Raúl Alfonsín, on matters not only of genetics but also forensic archaeology, anthropology, or ontology, as it was already evident as to where some of the clandestine graves were, or some of the clandestine burials. It so happened that many of them occurred in the cemeteries in the big cities in Argentina, both in Buenos Aires and Córdoba are the major ones that I know of. AAAS proceeded to do that, and I was part of that delegation as a coordinator with who then was the director of the committee, Eric Stover, a name who you will see resurface again in a moment when I take you to El Salvador, and also as a geneticist, and with a colleague, Professor Mary Claire King, now a professor at the University of Seattle, University of Washington in Seattle. Yes.
We call it the other place.
We understand. Yes, good. And as well as a distinguished delegation of odontologists and anthropologists, one of them Clyde Snow, who had been forensic specialist in this country, but never faced the application of their expertise to victims such as those in Argentina at the time. I think that trip had a defining moment on all of us. Clyde Snow became the champion of forensic anthropology and was instrumental in starting groups in South America and Central America that work to this day on the investigations looking for the missing. What happened was that if you ask in Argentina at the time, in April of 1984, the establishment of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists, the adults, those who had jobs in government agencies, they would not touch the topic. It was too soon. And therefore, Clyde Snow had a brilliant idea. He said, well, I'm going to go to the School of Medicine and recruit. And Grandmother's Plaza de Mayo said, yes, let's go together. And that's how the forensic anthropology team of Argentina was established, which now is one of the leading groups in the world doing this kind of work, under the venue of the UN, of governments that have transitioned to democracy and need this kind of work done because they don't have the expertise at home. Clyde Snow was also instrumental in starting a group in Chile, in Peru, which lasts to this day, the Grupo Peruano de Antropología Forense, and then one major one in Guatemala, the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala. To me, it meant that I began to scheme to totally change my professional future. Said enough of microbiology and molecular biology of microbes, which I was very interested in from its applied aspects. But what I know, I think I can bring to bear on this work. That it so happened, 1984 was a very defining year in genetics. I remember, and this happened, you know, I cannot forget. I took in the airplane on the way to Argentina the abstracts of the proceedings of the Biological Society. And there was one small abstract from a group at Berkeley by Alan Wilson and Russ Higuchi on the recovery of little bits of DNA from a museum specimen of an animal called quagga, which is an extinct animal, sort of a mix between a horse and zebra that existed in the southern cone in what's now South Africa. And it was of interest to look through DNA as to what was its evolutionary antecedent of this peculiar species. And then in late 1984, there is the first proceedings, also presentation at a meeting, of a technique called the polymerase chain reaction, which is, perhaps you have heard about it, which is a way of amplifying sequences of DNA very quickly in the lab from very small amounts of DNA recovered from any tissue, any specimen, any organism. It was evident at that time that that was not going to revolutionize our understanding, abilities, you know, to ask questions in genetics, which have led so many years later to the sequencing of entire genomes, but also that it was going to have an impact on human identification. And the history in this country in the application of all these techniques in forensic genetics has proven so. So in what I have left, I want to tell you the many examples that I know of, and I'm sure there are many more in other parts of the world, where this bringing of scientific knowledge into forensic investigations does not come from the governments, of course not. They're not interested in looking at the past. Even a democratically elected government will find arguments to tell itself that we need to look to the future. It is inconvenient to look at the past. It's inconvenient to bring issues of justice that will interfere with the reconciliation of a fractured society. This, of course, is a very interesting discussion as to how far you can take that argument. But governments are not going to be interested. Most of these terrible situations and human ignominy occurred in countries where science is not strong to begin with, and therefore forensic agencies of the government that needed forensic tools would be quite desolate in its ability to bring these kinds of modern techniques to bear on these kinds of investigations. And where has the force in order to bring science into investigations of human rights have been human rights organizations of the families of the victims. It was the case in Argentina with Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, who have done a remarkable work to this day. 1984 we visit. 1986 established by law the genetics bank of relatives of the families of the disappeared. That is, families of the disappeared of the members' families of grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo go to this one hospital in Buenos Aires, donate a little bit of blood, DNA is typed, it's stored. When a person is found, it's compared to that database, and perhaps an identification emerges. Argentina has one of the most modern laws, thanks to grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, on the right to identity. It's really worth reading. Not many countries do, even though they have signed the Covenant on the Rights of Children. 98 children have been found of about 500 that still need to be looked for. As of a few days ago, I mean on September 10th, Friday, I just got into the internet. I do this with some regularity. In September on Friday, a gentleman is found who the family, the grandparents, didn't know that that person existed, because when the mother was kidnapped, the family didn't know that she was pregnant. In Chile, there is the Association of Families of the Disappeared, which were instrumental in bringing, from 2006 on, this is 16 years after the first democratically elected government in Chile puts an end to the dictatorship there. Dictatorship, in Pinochet dictatorship, comes to an end in 1989. And it took 16 years for successive democratic governments to finally, under the leadership of our first woman president, Michelle Bachelet, to do something consequential in the investigation of disappearance. But that had to come from the lobbying and the insistence of Association of Families of the Disappeared. And again, the importance there of scientists talking to Association of Families of the Disappeared, of human rights organization, is instrumental. Just to give you an example, in 1984, after being in Argentina, we flew over to Santiago and we informed the human rights organizations there, in the middle of yet still 6 more years of dictatorship in Chile, as to how science was likely going to be useful in the search and identification of the loved ones. They didn't forget. Now let's go north to El Salvador. And I cordially invite you to attend this afternoon's meeting, because what I talk about, similar topic but in more depth, using this example of El Salvador as a prototype of how human rights organizations can become educated experts in science and demand to the political sphere and governments and international agencies to bring science to the task of searching for the missing ones. And this is, I can tell you briefly that in 2003, at the when I already now at the Department of Justice of the State of California in the Forensic Genetics Lab, Eric Stover, who's now moved from DC to establish the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, calls me and says that he wants to introduce us to Father John de Cortina, a Jesuit father from El Salvador who has lived most of his life in El Salvador through the Civil War, and who helped establish with families of missing children in El Salvador, missing from, as a consequence of the war. Many children were forcefully separated from their families and then given out in adoption. There was a little business also involved in the process. And 496 families established in 1994, soon after the end of the Civil War. Peace accords were signed under UN sponsorship in 1992. Father John de Cortina accompanies these families He is a professor of engineering at the university, knows about DNA, talks about the subject to the families. The family says, we have to have access to that technology. And in 2003, then, a coalition of, a consortium, if you will, of forensic scientists, volunteers from California, I included, begin to collaborate with ProBúsqueda, as it's called, Pro-Search of the Missing Children in El Salvador, to establish what now is a database of family references of about 1,064, which have been very useful in confirming by genetics the kinship of children found. 48 have been confirmed, 3 of them in cold hits. That's a term that is used in law enforcement, where you have a profile and you don't know whether that profile is in a database. In this case, there were 3 children, 3 adults, young adolescents in El Salvador, who from their history appeared that had been likely separated from the family during the Civil War. But ProBúsqueda, from all the evidence, could not place them to any one family. When that profile was compared to the family, to the database of family references, there was a hit. And there have been 3 cases of that, and likely there will be many more. There's so much more to talk about the ongoing work in all these countries. So much more. This is the work of a generation or 2, and if you ask me, of forever. Because a little piece of bone that cannot be identified today with present techniques is likely going to be identified in 10 more years with the advancement of the procedures that we now have at our disposal. And we're already seeing the advent of what's called single molecule DNA sequencing, where you don't need to amplify by the polymerase chain reaction. You can look at a single molecule and tell the sequence of the bases. So that's likely going to have an impact in what we can do in forensic investigations. Just to finish, I would like to acknowledge something very, very interesting where we can, as citizens in this country, can have a direct impact. Thanks to initiatives by 2 senators in the US Congress and willing people in the State Department, of the federal government, through the Office of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, has been funding DNA-related investigations for the identification of missing people in Central and South America. And that is a very welcome development. That has to continue, because we're just taking off on this. In very substantial ways, the foundation, the Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, has its own DNA lab now, which has been accredited by international norms. It's very important to emphasize that. It's very different to do genetics for identification in an academic lab versus a forensic lab where you need to have everything so well documented, plus have fulfilled many other requirements that are demanded of an accredited lab in order to present this evidence in court if it need be, and not be dismissed because it was not adequately obtained. The laboratory and the group in Guatemala will provide now a place in South America, in Latin America, if you will, where people can train and take back this knowledge to their countries without necessarily having to come to this country, which is all to the good, but there are elements of language and culture and idiosyncrasies that are sometimes better addressed in a regional manner. And with that, I think I've spoken enough, and it's your turn.
I think there's a microphone for those who want to ask questions. Let me begin. I'm fascinated about the politics side of this, of course.
Let's get into it.
And what you've described, it seems to me, is mostly non-governmental organizations that have been involved in this process. Is there any momentum to create an institution that would be able to assist in this worldwide, maybe under the aegis of the United Nations or something like that? Or is this all just being done by non-governmental organizations?
Well, there are two aspects two answers to your question. One is that, and I dwell on it this afternoon, an international body has been established in the form of the International Center for the International Commission on Missing Persons in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That was established in 1996, leadership by the White House, the Clinton years, with support since by the European community to identify the victims of the wars in the Balkans. And it has done a remarkable job. The estimation is that 30,000, or documentation, there is documentation to the disappearance of 30,000 persons. 18,000 have been already identified by DNA. And it is truly a DNA-driven identification, where anthropology has played a small role because many of the clandestine burials were lifted in order to hide the original existence of the burial, and the remains transferred somewhere else with the fracture of skeletons that would otherwise allow anthropologists to come to a conclusion. So there is an institution. ICMP, as it's called, International Commission on Missing Persons, is beginning to make a contribution in South America. It has an office in Colombia. Last year, and this you can find online, with funding from the government of Spain, issued a very thorough report on what Colombia would need to do in order to address the search and identification of the missing. Not unlikely that ICMP, with funding from the State Department, might do the same in El Salvador. El Salvador is an interesting tipping point. For the first time since the end of the civil war there is a progressive, by that I mean center-left government elected last year, which is willing to look into the past. Earlier governments did not want to touch it. That's number one. Number two, in Latin America, there are different attitudes about, depending on where you look at, as to what the government should or should not do. In Argentina, until very recently, I would say that the human rights organizations were so distrustful of the government that they'd rather have all this done in private labs, accredited labs, and by organizations such as the anthropology group in Argentina. Chile is different. The Association of Families of the Disappeared are insisting that the government modernize its facilities so as to do this work well. And my participation in the Presidential Commission 2006-2009 was precisely reflecting that demand. They want the government to be responsible and to do it well and to be internationally accredited, to bring and to do it well and to bring all that evidence to justice, of course, to the courts. El Salvador, I think I see the same attitude. Should the government needs to do it. In Guatemala, I don't think the question has been raised because the government is so dysfunctional with the rest of civil society, if I may be permitted a political scientist evaluation. But Guatemala is such a hazardous terrain in terms of government, civil society, that they are doing it on their own, yeah, with some support from some progressive agencies that the government does have. Most of these governments, El Salvador, El Salvador and Guatemala have procuradores de derechos humanos. They're called attorney generals for human rights. Yeah, semi-independent persons who should look for the rights of persons, and they have a capacity of presentation within the government to denounce human rights violations. The office in Guatemala as well and now in El Salvador are collaborating with the human rights organizations in new ways to make this work more effective. By that I mean the search and the identification of these.
Can you speak to Guatemala specifically with the ongoing case against Rios Montt and his membership in Congress now? Can you elaborate on that from this perspective? What this new research has to do with the ongoing investigation there?
Not very much, but I don't know all the details. You know, it reminds me of when Pinochet was senator for life in the Chilean Congress for a little while, until he had to resign in 1998 after spending 503 days detained in London. You might recall that the very active judge in Spain wanted to extradite Pinochet to Spain for the possible responsibility of the assassination of Spanish citizens in the 1970s. But let me say this. The remarkable thing about NGOs and these human rights organizations is that regardless of what the political atmosphere is in the country, they don't stop. And that, and those are, every example that I have talked about today can demonstrate that regardless of the ups and downs of the political context in which they can do or not do, they just do. And a very dramatic example, the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala is the first group of its kind that establishes its own forensic genetics lab, even with Rios Montt in Congress, as it should be.
Are early efforts by human rights organizations in some of these countries, has the government sort of cracked down on the human rights organizations and the human rights individuals? I mean, has there been an effort to sort of quash or kill human rights individuals in these countries when they try to dig up the past, so to speak?
Yes, and Guatemala again is a good example, again related to the gentleman in the back. The key individuals from the foundation in Guatemala, Freddy Pecherelli, who is a person who with of much visibility and leadership, he has been innumerable times, he and his family, threatened. But he hasn't left. And fortunately, no one in his family has been injured in any way. They have been all threats, very, very terrifying threats. But here the value of international solidarity is demonstrated again and again. International human rights organizations the world over make presentations to the government in Guatemala protesting. And again, political figures in this country as well, senators and representatives, communicate to the government that they're concerned about these threats, and that seems to protect them so far. Those are the cases that I, look on the internet, and you will see the long history of threats to the personnel of the foundation. I wouldn't be surprised that there are many others. Shall I be?
Sure.
Yes.
Did you say that government funding was going to help fund private human rights organizations in South America, or did I misunderstand that?
Yes.
Okay. Is there like a system in place to, to make sure that they're spending the money correctly? Or like, do we oversee the operation at all, or do we just give them the money and then?
Oh, let me tell you about that, because I'm PI, if you will, in one of them. The one that has funded, that came to an end in June of this year, and we are applying again for 3 more years. The State Department gives grants of this kind to human rights organizations. The ones that I know of are was about $1.5 million that was 4 years ago, it's going to be now, was distributed through this human identification DNA initiative. Part was received by the Argentinian group, another by the Peruvian, another by the Guatemalan, and then Probuscia. The Probuscia I know about, and they all are administered in the following way. A counterpart agency in this country, a non-profit, has to be the one that receives the grant. And in this case, it's the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. And then the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley funds Probuscia for the 3 years in hiring investigators, in paying for DNA analysis, though in this case we haven't yet had to pay for DNA analysis because of pro bono work by us in California, and then a private lab in Arizona called Chromosomal Labs has been helping us, but that's coming to an end. And then investigation work here in this country. The Human Rights Center hired 2 student assistants during those 3 years, because of the 511 children that have yet to be found from the Probuscia families, the larger majority most likely reside in this country and in Europe. And therefore, there is a lot of outreach work that has to be done. So the grants are audited. Every 3 months, a report has to be sent to the Office of Democracy and Human Rights. And then at the end, an independent audit has to be done of the 3 years. And we went through that. And all of that is available, should be available to the public. And if you are interested, we can make it available.
Has there been kind of, thank you, because of the U.S. involvement in, and the U.S. being instrumental in some of these dictatorships ever occurring, for example, in Chile, has there been a demand by the people in those countries of U.S. involvements in human rights investigations and making it right, such as what you were just talking about? Is there further requests for that, or is that sort of a non-issue in the countries?
The human identification DNA initiative by the State Department is the result of many years of lobbying by human rights organizations in South America, with the support of a human rights organization in Washington called Washington Office on Latin America, which is a group that keeps tabs on every member of Congress on how they are voting on human rights issues. And WALA was able to work very closely with Senator Leahy, Vermont, in order to make this funding that was channeled through the State Department, as just described. It makes, I know that Probuscia and El Salvador had to think twice about accepting funding from the U.S. government. And there is a dilemma. But not to me. I think that the right to correct is something that a government has to be given the opportunity of, and certainly the US government has much to correct in its interventions in Central and South America. As you know, or you may agree, so many efforts in protecting democracy in the Southern Cone have been resulted in precisely the opposite. Maybe we should invent another way of doing it to obtain desired results.
Hi, I am actually currently working on my honors thesis, and I lived in Chile last year, and I'm writing about the relationship between El Mercurio, which is the main Chilean newspaper, and national, considered like the newspaper of history, or the national newspaper of Chile, and how specifically they covered the events that occurred before the golpe de Estado, before the Pinochet dictatorship, and afterwards covering the human rights violations and events that occurred from that. I guess I'm just asking if you could comment maybe a little bit more on your experience working within Chile and the repercussions of that, I suppose. Kind of a broad question, sorry, but yeah.
Let me respond with a question. Do you have the video El Diario de Agustín?
I don't have it, but I've seen it, and I'm trying to track down my own copy, but
I can make it
Yeah.
available.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I have extra copies, in fact.
Oh, really?
It's a video, it's a documentary, precisely on that question that was made in the last 3 years
phenomenal,
or
yeah.
so. In which it as well, here you. This is what the El Mercurio, which is the leading newspaper, and still is.
It still is, yeah.
Yeah. Some things have been learned by El Mercurio, I would think, on the basis of what El Mercurio, how El Mercurio has covered the how many years was it? 20 years of center-left governments in Chile after the Pinochet government came to an end. Has been, by and large, honorable, I would say, as journalism goes, when a newspaper has a clear, the ownership of the newspaper is clearly in the hands of people of a known political stance. So in that sense, I look forward to reading your thesis. Whether you prove me right or wrong. I'm giving El Mercurio the benefit of the doubt at the moment. Yeah.
First, it's a question, I guess. What do you think is the future outlook, I guess, of the application of these techniques, not only for helping families reunite, but actually to bring accountability to those who were responsible for atrocities? And then the second is just as a Latin American to say, muchas gracias por su trabajo, which is well appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I'm touched by your second statement. Thank you so much. On the first, very bright. And again, I mean, there's so much to share. Human rights organizations are showing the way. El Salvador, Probúsqueda, presents the case of 2 of the 811 children to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. It's the one international court in the Americas. It was established by the OAS, the Organization of American States, that has international jurisdiction throughout the Americas. I don't know if it includes Canada. That I would have to look into. And in 2005, well, earlier than 2005, Probúsqueda is able to present a case of 2 sisters who were abducted, and all supporting evidence. And in May of 2005, it comes to the conclusion that the government of El Salvador is responsible for the enforced disappearance of those 2 Serrano sisters, and demands of the government to take certain steps, which the earlier government did in some ways and not others. But now the current government of President Funes is intent, it would seem, to really do something about it. And this comes from Probuscia, I assure you. We had nothing to do. That is, this Probuscia at the time, John de Cortina was alive. That gentleman died in December of 2005. Very much missed. A charming, courageous, remarkable person. The Inter-American Court demands of the El Salvador government to establish a genetic bank of families of the disappeared, which it hasn't done it so far, but likely that it will be done now in this new administration. And then demands to establish active search of the two sisters, which it hasn't done. And Probuscia has been successful in presenting 3 more cases that were just accepted a month ago by the Inter-American Court, and one of them was of a young woman who was found. This time it's presenting a case of a person who was found, and with that evidence then bring charges to the government of El Salvador. And to our delight, because we had something to do with it, that person is, her name is Gregoria Herminia Contreras Resino, her kinship was established by DNA. And therefore the court will receive evidence, DNA evidence. And we are being asked to propose, we being this alliance of forensic scientists in California, this informal group of volunteers, to have someone be available in case the court, when it meets sometime later during this year, should it need to receive an explanation, an expert witness, from an expert witness on DNA matters. So the infiltration, if you will, of DNA evidence into the international court system is beginning. And again, thanks to the initiative of the human rights organizations. As of a year and a half ago, the International Criminal Court of The Hague had not taken formally any DNA evidence, which I'm surprised, given that so much has been done at the International Center for Missing Persons. But that the day will come.
All right, well, unfortunately, our time is up. So now, on behalf of the Foley Institute, I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Orrego for a really fascinating and I think a hopeful discussion in an otherwise kind of bleak topic.
Yes. Thank you.